Thank you very much. Good evening. How are you? Fine. I am well also. Okay. So today we are getting on to a third in this series of talks on decolonial thinking. How do we think about colonial knowledge, and therefore so we would be able to engage in a much more informed process or task of decolonizing knowledge. What I thought we're going to do tonight is to move a bit away from the university and the disciplinary knowledges that we've been focusing on in the past two lectures, but look at thought generally, inclusive of the university, but also outside of the university, because the effectivity of thought is not just in the classroom. It is in how it shapes the way in which we live our lives, even outside of the classroom generally, how it tells us what is right in society, what is wrong in society, what is permissible and what is not permissible, or what we think is supposedly the desirable in life and otherwise. So knowledge, when it has been taught to us in the classroom, does several things to us. It doesn't just give us the certificates with which to go and work for white people, but it also shapes our behavior. It determines how we relate with each other, such that when you no longer speak your language as a Motswana, as a Xhosa person, you then are more comfortable relating to white people than relating with your own people, because you no longer speak the language of your own people. So what education does is that it determines the way in which we live in the world. It determines how we relate with each other, how we relate with the world generally. So when you've been thoroughly immersed in Western knowledge, you think of the world, or you relate with the world in a certain rational, calculable way. You think that your actions in the world must be rational and calculated all the time, such that everything you do must advance yourself, or rather must advance you in life. So you must have a rational explanation for everything you do. That's how modern education shapes the way in which you live in the world. So if I gave you an explanation for things I do that is not rational, you don't understand, or if I drew on the metaphysical to explain what I do in the world, you no longer are able to relate to it, because Western education says that everything I do in this world must be rational, and I must be engaged in a rational, calculable relationship, with the world. So what I thought I'm going to do today is to move us, as I've said, out of the classroom a bit and outside of the disciplinary knowledges, to show how generally thought, Western thought informs the way in which we live in the world, how it determines our being in the world, how some of the things that you think are your own, personal volitions or decisions, things that you think are expressive of your agency and autonomy, I want to show you that those things are generally not. These things are already determined for you in Western thought already. All you do is basically to play out a script that is already written for you by Western thought. So when you go to work, for instance, and begin to dress in a certain way when you work, you think that it's your own personal choice, that, now I'm a professional, I must dress in a certain way, It's not your personal choice. It's a world that is already determined for you, because there is an industry that must survive. There is a textile industry that must survive that says that for a professional person, you must dress formally and in this way. That's how it is able to reproduce itself, because it has implanted in your mind a certain idea of how a professional should appear. There's nothing that would happen. If you went to work as a CEO wearing a short, there's nothing that will happen. The world will not come down collapsing. Your work does not depend on how you dress, as a CEO of any company. But we're going to arrive at that point, via a different route. So what I thought we were going to do is to look at, the thoughts of a South African clinical psychologist called Chabani Manganyi. Now, as I've said, Chabani Manganyi was a clinical psychologist, or is a clinical psychologist. He, amongst other things, wrote a number of texts. The text that we are going to look at closely today, or that we are going to base ourselves on today, is a text titled Being Black in the World. It was published in 1978. Its task is to try and explain how, as a black person, you live in the world, or what it means to be black in the world. Now, you would perhaps not be familiar. The title Being Black in the World in the text is a play on another text, a much earlier text written by a German phenomenologist called Heidegger, who wrote Being and Time. In it, Heidegger talks about modes of being in the world. How do we live in the world? How do we express our being, in the world? Which is not to say that Chabani Manganyi simply mimics, Heidegger. He has a completely different, trajectory, or rather he takes off, in a completely different trajectory as opposed to Heidegger. Heidegger had absolutely no idea of, the continent and being black in Africa, So Chabani Manganyi's expositions in being black in the world, are completely different. But as I've said, it references Heidegger's text. Now, Chabani Manganyi is an important figure in thought taught properly in South Africa. As I've said, he's a clinical psychologist. But I have found out that it is possible in South Africa to study psychology, from first year right up to PhD without ever being taught, the works of Chabani Manganyi. Because, to begin with, in psychology at UCT, there is not a single black South African, who teaches there, who therefore would be familiar with Chabani Manganyi's work. But secondly, the academics that are in psychology, at UCT are not familiar with this work. They've never encountered, Chabani Manganyi's work. Now, this is the point. I mentioned this to drive the point home about what it means to decolonize education. Because how it is that Chabani Manganyi, whose achievements in a moment would become obvious to you, is not known and not taught in South Africa, it must baffle the mind. Chabani Manganyi counts to his name well over 20 books, including, amongst others, as I've said, Being Black in the World. He's just released his memoirs, Psychology, A Psychologist and Apartheid. Other than that, he wrote a biography of Eskia Mphahlele. Other than that, he wrote the biography of Dumile Feni, who, again, I'm sure is not known to many of you. Dumile Feni was South Africa's renowned, visual artist who died in exile. So he wrote a biography of Dumile Feni. He wrote a book titled Looking Through the Keyhole. Another of his texts is Psychology and the Treasury of Apartheid, and several other texts. He wrote a biography of an important South African figure, called Gerard Sekoto. Gerard Sekoto is an artist. He's a black artist, again, who died in exile in France. Sekoto's traded his obscurity by painting, a work of art called The Song of the Pig. Do you know that artwork? Now, it's an artwork that has a white Afrikaner standing, watching black workers working, with the pigs, digging on the roadside, with their pigs. It's the famous, artwork that depicts how apartheid relations, black-white relations, played themselves out, in South Africa. So, Chabani Manganyi wrote a biography of Gerard Sekoto titled I'm an African. Now, all of these things are not taught in the South African Academy. I'm sure people who study art, and history of art in South Africa, most likely would not know Gerald Sekoto. Most likely they would not know Tumile Feni. Most likely they would not know of these works by Chabani Manganyi on these scholars. This is to show how, knowledge that is taught in South Africa, remains deep-based, or in a sense, has no relationship with this society. When you study the history of art in Germany, you are taught the history of art in Germany, how art in Germany evolved. But when you are taught the history of art in South Africa, you are taught the history of art as it evolved in Europe, not in South Africa. Now, that's the colonial character of knowledge that, we are talking about. So, Chabani Manganyi, as I've said, was a clinical psychologist, who wrote several texts, including the ones that, we have mentioned. At different points, he worked, in different universities, but, most recently, before he retired, he was Deputy Vice Chancellor at the University of Pretoria. And prior to that, he had been Vice Chancellor at TEFLO, the university, then University of the North, now the University of Limpopo. So, when we build a body of knowledge that is reflective of us as black people in this country, these are the people who are going to teach. These are the kinds of knowledges that we are going to teach, so that we cease teaching you about Italian artists, when we teach you, the history of art, or when we teach you psychology. We must not teach you Freud. We must teach you Chabani Manganyi, so that you can have a sense of the discipline that relates, to the people that we are going to be working with. So Chabani Manganyi, in this book titled Being Black in the World, it was published in 1978. So as far back as 1978, you had people in South Africa that were quite aware, of the fact that there was a certain way of being in the world, that was distinctly black. Or, better put, by 1978, there were people in South Africa that were aware that being white in the world and being black in the world constituted two different schemas. They were aware that white people habit the world differently from the way in which we habit the world. So all the things we did in 2015, about, how, being black at UCT alienates and all of those things, these are things that people like Chabani Manganyi had known way back in 1978 and written about, in several of their works. So if you had been taught properly, you would have known that there was nothing novel about what you did in 2015, because these were things that, people had thought about and written about way before, 2015. So in 1978, Chabani Manganyi publishes this book titled Being Black in the World. At the time when he publishes this book in 1978, he had just returned from a teaching, spell at Yale University from 1973. So by 1973, Chabani Manganyi had been teaching at Yale University, but what is important is not that he was teaching at Yale University, it is the fact that at Yale, he was teaching a seminar on the works of a philosopher called Camus. Now, Camus is a philosopher of the absurd. He's a philosopher of the absurd who's written, several texts, including The Plague, The Myth of Sisyphus, The Outsider, The Rebel, and several other texts. Now, there's something, interesting about the fact that Chabani Manganyi had been teaching a postgrad seminar on Camus, who, as we've said, was a philosopher of the absurd. In The Myth of Sisyphus, which is Camus' most popular work, in this work, Camus explores how suicide may be a solution to what he calls the absurdity of life. Now, what I want to retrieve from this is this notion of the absurdity of life, or the absurd. Enough of those preliminaries. We'll encounter that notion of the absurd, as we proceed. So what I want us to do now is to delve straight, yeah. So, in order for us to make sense of Chabani Manganyi's work, and what it teaches and what lessons it holds for us in decolonizing, thought, I think the starting point would be to recognize that the clamor for a decolonized education system would not make sense, or rather, you cannot possibly or realistically hope to have a decolonized education system in a society that remains colonial. So if you haven't decolonized society generally, you can't have decolonized, education, because remember, education sits in a functional relationship with how society is organized. We've gone through that to show how modern disciplinary knowledges emerge in relation to the modern form of life. So, if you have a colonial society, you can't have a decolonized education system. Or, if the values of society remain colonial, then you can't have a decolonized education system, because an education system does not function in isolation of the society that, it is founded on. So the reason why education in South Africa remains as racist as it is because society remains racist. The reason why there are certain things that are possible in the university in South Africa today, that's why you still have people like Benata, who say all the kinds of upset things they say. It is because society itself remains congenial to those kinds of racist values. So if they lived in a different society where, those kinds of things would not be acceptable to societal sensibilities, it would be impossible for them to function. So you can't have a decolonized education system in a society that remains colonial. That is why I thought that today we must expand our scope and get out of the university and see how, in the world generally, Western knowledge has shaped a colonial society. Now, I want to start, by suggesting something to you that Chabani Manganyi, makes obvious in his work. Think of, let's do a thought experiment. When a white person says, I, do you get a sense that when a black person also says I, those two I's carry the same weight? Or let's try and explicate. When a white person says, I think that this is not right, and when a black person says, I think this is not right, do you think that those two statements carry the same weight? Certainly not. The valuation of the I of the white person is much more than the valuation of the I of the black person. Now, the reason for that is not just the material superiority or the material privilege of a white person. The higher valuation of the I of the white person does not derive from the fact that the white person is richer and the poor person, or rather the black person, is poorer. You can even reverse the scales and have a white person, a poor white person, and have a rich black person. When a rich black person says that, I think that this is not right, and a white person says, I think this is not right, again, the valuation of those I's, is likely to carry a different weighting. There is an I that is likely to carry more weight. It is the I of the white person. Now, as we've said, that weighting, that superior weighting or higher valuation of the I of the white person does not derive from material resources. It's not founded on the fact that white people are richer. You can, as we've said, you can reverse the scales, the results would be the same. So where does it flow from? I want to suggest to you that it flows from somewhere else. And to understand where it flows from, you have to realize that there is a certain symmetry, not asymmetry, there's a certain symmetry or coterminality between the I of the white person and the we of the white person. So when a white person says I, he or she calls with that I or evokes or activates the views of the rest of the white people. So when he says I, you get a sense that he's not just speaking for or about himself, he's speaking for the entirety of the white race. I mean, so when he says that I don't like it, you get a sense that it is not just him or her that doesn't like that, it is the rest of the white people. Whereas for you as a black person, when you say I or me, you have to justify only within yourself what you are saying. So the value of what you are saying does not evoke any collective that is in support of your I or me. Whereas the me or the I of a white person evokes the rest of the white population. Now, if it's still confusing, it will become clearer in a moment what we mean. Between the I of the white person, the cultural resources, the knowledge resources, the material resources of the I of a white person are the cultural resources, the material resources, and the knowledge resources of the entirety of the white population. Or, when a white person says I or this is not right, he or she, without announcing it, bases that conclusion on the cultural values that are derived from the white culture. Because there is a certain coterminality between the I and the we of white people. Or, better put, there is no distinction between a white person's individual values and white people's societal values. Do you get what I mean? There is no distinction between a white person's individual values and a white person's societal values. The white person's values, his or her behavior, his or her outlook, his or her thinking, is the thinking of white people generally. Because the world has been made in the image of white people. So for them, when they say I, they are already talking within the collective. What justifies that I is the white nature of life, generally, and the white nature of life, generally, the white nature of how society is organized. Whereas for you, you can shout all your I and me as a black person, it does not make sense, it's debased. It only makes sense within, it is riddled with a certain inertia. It is inward looking. So you have to tell us why I think this way. You have to tell us why I think this is right. You have to justify everything you say in the name of the I. Whereas a white person does not need to justify those kinds of values that he or she claims are his or hers. Because those values are the values of the collective, but also are the values of society. In fact, he or she, a white person, can already see those values in you as a black person already. He or she is sure that you must agree with him that his or her values are your values also, because his or her values are universal. Your own values, are not universal. Your own values are particular. So when you say I, you particularize yourself. When a white person says I, he or she universalizes himself. Does that make sense? So, in the scheme of life, in the scheme of modern life, there is a certain weight that has been given to the I of the white person by the way in which society is organized on the basis of white culture, on the basis of, white values. Because white values have become societal values generally. The white way or the white mode of being in the world has become the generalized mode of being in the world. You all aspire to be like white people. In your lives, most of the things that you do suggest to anyone that, your aspiration is to be like white people. Short of the fact that you know that you can't just change your skin color. But otherwise, you speak like them, you aspire to be like them in the way in which you live. Because white values have become generalized as societal values. So you think that in order to succeed in society, you must be closer in everything you do to white people. In the way in which you speak, in the way in which you appear in the world, in the way in which you do everything, you think that your success is hinged on you being closer to white people. You do not think that your success as a black person, means taking yourself closer to being Tswana, immersing yourself even deeper to being Xhosa or a Zulu person. You think that you must move as far as possible from that kind of being in the world or that mode of being in the world and get closer to, the Western mode of being in the world in order for you to succeed. Because the world has been constructed in such a way that being white or approximating the white mode of being in the world assures you, quote and unquote, it doesn't quite assure you. It pretends to assure you success. Because quickly, or at every given moment, the white world reminds you that you are trying too hard, to be like the white people. So, the point we want to make here is that between the I of the white person and the we of the white person, there is no difference. There is coterminality. The individual values of a white person are the collective values of the white society. Whereas for a black person, your individual values are not, the collective values of society. So, Chabani Manganyi's point in being black in the world is to suggest that actually there are two different ways of habiting the world. And of course, he was focusing on South Africa. He says that if you look at the South African society, there is a way in which white people habit the world that is different from how black people habit the world. And we've already seen how, these two modes of habiting the world are different, because we've seen that when a white person says I, it does not mean the same thing as when you as a black person says I. Now, if the I of the white person is already a collective, as a black person, when you say I, you are already at a disadvantage because your I is not a collective, or it has no, resonance in any collective form of life. Whereas the I of a white person has resonance in a collective, form of life that is white. Now, this is one way in which being in the world, for black people and white people differs. So as we've said, Chabani Manganyi's point was to show that there are different ways of habiting the world, or there are white modes of being in the world and black modes of being in the world. Let us try and make this, a little clearer, so that also the I and the we of the black person and of the white person, would become clearer to us. So Chabani Manganyi says that, and we've said that, of course, Chabani Manganyi was a psychologist, a clinical psychologist. So he takes off from that tradition of thought, which is psychology. He starts off by saying that for every human being in the modern world, there are two anchors. He doesn't quite call them anchors, he calls them schemas. He says that for every person in the modern world, there are two schemas that, actually anchor your being in the world. So as an individual person, you have what is called, or what he calls, an individual schema. So you have a sense of who you are. In the individual schema, you are able to tell yourself who you are. So you grow up with a certain notion of who you are. I'm Lwazi Lushaba. I have this character, I have this disposition towards life generally. You can heave off, a whole host of characteristics that, define you, as an individual person. So that is what he calls an individual schema. So as an individual person, you have a sense of self. So think of this individual schema as a sense of self. You have a sense of self, you're a moral person, you keep to time, you're stickler for time, you are, dutiful and all those kinds of things. You know who you are, you have a sense of who you are. And these things are not just who you are, they guide how you live in the world. They provide you with the resources, of navigating your being in the world. So if you think of yourself as a moral person, there are things then that you do not do. There are things that are beyond, your purview. They are beyond, the doable for you because you think of yourself as a moral person. So the individual schema is not just an idle list or index of characteristics. It actually, what helps you being in the world. It enables you live in the world in a certain way. It provides you the cultural resources with which to navigate your life in the world. Now, opposed to the individual schema, there is a schema that, is not yours as an individual person. There is a schema that is societal. This is what, Chabali Mangani calls the sociological schema. So as an individual black person, as Lwazi Lushaba, I have a sense of myself. I'm a stickler for time, I'm a moral person or whatever else. But there is a certain schema that is not mine, that is societal, about me. The schema is not just, a general schema, it is about me. So you may think, for instance, of yourself as a black person, as someone who's moral, as someone who is dutiful, as someone who's honest. But there is a certain view of you in society as a black person that does not correspond to your individual schema. So as a black person, there is a view of you in South Africa that, first and foremost, you are licentious. There is a schema that suggests that you are given to lying as a black person. There is a schema that says that you are lazy as a black person. There is a schema that says that you are sexually permissive as a black person. All of these things are not derived from your character as an individual black person. And all of these things have nothing to do with your individual, predilections. But it is that in South Africa, we know what a black person is, isn't it? A black person is lazy, is corrupt, is sexually permissive, is idle, intellectually lacking, morally lacking, culturally lacking, and all of that. And indeed, that's how the world relates with you as a black person, on the basis of this sociological schema. Now, if you do not believe this, let me give you a bad example. By now you know that I prefer bad examples. Because they drive the point home. They are difficult to forget. In South Africa, being bright is an exclusive preserve. According to the sociological schema that prevails in South Africa, being bright is a preserve of white people. So I go to teach. In certain instances, I teach classes that are wholly white. And it amazes me that white people find it necessary after class to come and tell me that we are bright. If I were a white person, would they do the same? It is because the supposition is that as a white person you are bright. It's a given. But not only that, they are intrigued when they see a black person who appears bright. And so they find a reason to verbalize it and tell the person that, so when they say you are bright, they are saying you are not like all the black people we know. Because there is a certain sociological schema that governs how black people are looked at. There's a certain sociological schema that says who you are as a black person. And that sociological schema, as we've said, has nothing to do with your individual characteristics. Or, to give you another bad example, one of the things that I know I do, I keep time. But the world knows black people as people who do not keep time. So it doesn't matter how hard I try, and ensure that I'm on time every time, I have to be in a certain place. When I get out to the world, does the world say that black people keep time? So even if all of you here were to try hard in your lives and keep to time, the sociological schema in this country is such that black people do not have a sense of time. And so they do not keep time. And that's how the world relates with you. So it doesn't matter what you do. The sociological schema determines how the world relates with you. Or, again, you may live your life in a certain way, in a morally upright way, morally, in a general sense, in a morally upright way. But the world looks at you as a black person as being sexually permissive. It doesn't matter what you do in your individual life, to ensure that you live a morally upright life. When the world encounters you, it encounters a sexually permissive person. If it had a way of finding out that you were not sexually permissive, it would say, wow, that's interesting. So, Shabani Manganyi's point is that you have in society an individual schema, the way in which you think of yourself and think of who you are and how you live your life. But that individual schema is overdetermined by a sociological schema, the way in which society thinks of you. So, such that in as much as you may think of yourself as a certain kind of person, that is immaterial in a world where your individual schema is contrary to the sociological schema. Because society is what would enable you live in the world. So your value, you cannot apportion your value to yourself as an individual. So you cannot say because you know yourself to be morally upright and therefore there must be at least a sociological schema that applies only to you as a black person that says that you are not sexually permissive. No. The sociological schema that prevails is the one that says you are sexually permissive. Now this is why we began with the eye of the black person and contrasted it with the eye of a white person. Because the point I was driving home is that the individual schema of a white person is the sociological schema. So for a white person, his or her individual schema is the sociological schema. Whereas for you, your individual schema is not the sociological schema. So, when a white person says I, he's invoking, a much larger cultural reservoir, which is the one of, the sociological schema, because when a white person says I, he's invoking how the world thinks about a white person. What are the values that, attend to a white person? When you think of a white person, what do you think of? You think of intellectual capability. You think of, morality. You think of, a cultured person. You think of all those attributes. Now, when a white person says I, he or she is calling on all of those, attributes that you think of when you think about the white person. So when you think of the white suburbs, you think about the serenity of life, that prevails, in the white suburbs. So when a white person says I, he's calling all of those, or he's activating, or she's activating all those cultural resources that you do not have as a black person. Because for him or her, his or her individual schema is the same with the sociological schema. And so, because the individual and the sociological schema of the white person are one, or there is coterminality between the individual schema and the sociological schema of a white person, the white person experiences being in the world differently from you as a black person. Because for a white person, as we've said, his or her individual values are societal values. So there's no moment for a white person where he has to step outside of his or her I into something else. At an individual level, he's already in the collective. At an individual level, he's already in the sociological, in the larger sociological schema. So in his individual schema, when he gives himself or herself his individual attributes, he's already talking about the collective sociological attributes. Do you get the point? Whereas for you, as a black person, when you say I, that, I hear young people these days, talk about as if they had a world that supports, their schema. When you say I, you are saying it's vacuous, it means nothing. It's empty. It doesn't call any, cultural values that support it. It has no repertoire from which to tap, unlike the I of a white person. So your own I is unlike the I of, the white person, as we've said, because the I of the white person is grounded in this much larger repertoire. And this repertoire is not just cultural, it's not just, moral, it's not just about intellect, it's also built over time through Western knowledge. It is Western knowledge that has made us to come to think of white people the way in which we think about them. At the end, would show how all of this boils down to the mode of, knowledge that we're exposed to in the universities, how it is basically, the colonial character of our knowledge systems that gives to us these kinds of schemas that, we live in the world through. So, the point we are slowly, trying to make here is that, so for a white person, there is a different mode of being in the world. Because for a white person, as we've said, there is coterminality between the individual schema and the sociological schema. Whereas for a black person, there is a disjuncture between your individual schema and the sociological schema. So all the things that you know about yourself, the world belies them. Or, except if you were Jacob Zuma, at least the world confirms them. But virtually everything about you as an individual person, all the things you know about yourself, the world belies them. Does that make sense? So everything you think you are, the world denies it to you. It refuses to confirm all the things that you know about yourself. You think of yourself as being bright, the world says black people are foolish. You think of yourself as being a cultured person, the world says that black people have no culture. You think of yourself as being morally upright, the world says that black people are sexually permissive. You think of yourself as having a history, the world says black people have no history. So, what happens for black people is that the world denies virtually everything that they think of themselves or they think about themselves. So everything they think of, in their individual schema that they think they are, the world denies it to them, unlike white people. So the mode of being in the world of black people is different from that of white people, because what then happens is that because for black people there is this disjuncture between the individual schema and the sociological schema, is that as a black person you come to experience your body as an object. as a black person, because of this disjuncture that we've spoken of, you come to experience your body as an object. Because your body is outside of yourself, it becomes something that is outside of yourself because of this disjuncture. How? Now you think of yourself as a confident person, and you think that you're a cultured person. The world says, you may be cultured, but you see, in order to succeed, we don't need your culture. We need this model of a person. We need a person who appears in this way. And what do? You then leave your culture. You leave everything you've told yourself about how good it is to be Venda, how good it is to be Tswana. And the world says to you, we don't need all of that from you. We need you to appear in this way. We need you to be closer to white people. We need you in your appearance, to be closer to what. We need you in your values, to evoke the white values. We need you in the way in which you speak to be closer to white people, so that you may succeed. So what happens for black people is that they come to experience their bodies as objects. You have to prepare your body as something that is available to the white world. Or you come to prepare your body as something that is comprehensible to the white world, or as something that the white world is ready to live with. So you leave your body as an object, that is outside of yourself, because as we've said, despite everything that you tell yourself about your culture and everything else, the white world or the sociological schema disputes it. It denies virtually everything that you tell yourself about, in your moment when you talk about your individual schema. As I think about this, the good example is you must look at black people who grow up in adopted white families. If you're a black person and you're adopted by a white family, so you live your life, for a good number of years, probably until you are 20-something, thinking that I'm equal to white people, I'm the same with them. I live with them, until you come into consciousness, you see that the world actually, treats you differently. So all the things that you've told yourself growing up in this white family, that I'm the same with my adopted or my stepbrother, whatever, and my stepsister, you think you are the same and you have the same value, in the world. Once you come into consciousness, the world tells you no. It's not so, you're not the same. Your lives do not have the same value. You see, the sociological schema, or rather the individual schema of your brother or your white sister, is the sociological schema of the world. Your own sociological schema, it's not that of the world. And this is where people who grow up in adopted families then collapse. This is when they break, in life, because they then suddenly realize that, they had been living a facade. They had been living, a lie, basically, for a lack of a better term. So this is why, adoption, cross-racial adoption, for a right-thinking society is not a desirable thing, at least in this society, because it actually destroys people. It's better to grow up in your poverty as a black person. The likelihood is that, you would have much better cultural resources to cope in the world than someone who grows up, in a white world and then discovers that the world actually, is not black, is anti-black, and therefore does not have the resources with which to cope, with the world. There are studies. In fact, Shabani Manganyi, one of the things that he did was basically to study this phenomenon, of how people who grow up in adopted families collapse when they come into consciousness. But nonetheless, the point here is that for a black person, because, as we've said, everything you tell yourself, in your individual schema is denied to you, by the society or in the sociological schema. As we've said, you then come to live your life, or rather you come to experience your body as an object. You basically become an object, of this sociological schema, or this sociological schema imposes on you a certain way of treating your body. And as we've explained, Basically, the sociological schema says that, you relate to every black person as being culturally decrepit. You relate to every black person as intellectually lacking. You relate to every black person, as sexually permissive. And so, as we've said, it doesn't matter what you do in your individual life. This is what you encounter in the world. This is how you encounter the world. But it is not only that this is how you encounter the world, this is how the world actually treats you. So the materiality of this is that it's not only at the level of ideas, at the level of what people tell you, or at the level of how we see the world when we think about it. It is that in reality, this is how the world relates to you as a black person. The world, particularly this country, has a way of relating to a black person. Think of it. If you do not believe, when white people complain in this country, do you get a sense that the government responds the same way when black people complain?
No.
It is because they know, even though they are black, even though the government is black, it knows that the sociological schema says you must treat white people in this way. And you must treat black people in this way. Because they have unequal valuation in society. And this unequal valuation is as a result of the fact that the sociological schema that prevails, is a white sociological schema. So in less sophisticated way, what you have in South Africa today is a black government that basically is upholding and defending a white world. So what they do, when they relate to white people, they are saying, well, this is your world, this is your cultural world, this is the world that you have shaped, in the way in which, you have shaped it and want it to be, and so it will be so. For a black person, when you complain and say whatever you say, they treat, black people with disregard and scorn, because black people have a different valuation in society, in fact, a lesser valuation in society. So that is why we say that, for black people, when you shout "I," it doesn't make sense. When a white person can confront an army of police and say, "I want to pass through." When you say, "I want to pass through," short of smacking you, it is because for a white person, when he says "I," he's invoking the entirety of the white people. He's basically invoking the entirety of white people and say, the white culture wants to pass. Whereas for you, you aren't able, to call on any such repository, as you talk to the police. So it is evident at this point, I'm sure, that as black people, we habit the world differently from white people. So Chabani Manganyi's point in being black in the world was to say that there is a certain mode of being in the world that is white. There is a certain mode of being in the world that is black. And we understand these two different modes in part as we have explained. But let us try and probe further, how white people habit the world differently from black, people, and see how the individual schema of white people is the sociological schema, and how for black people, it is the opposite. It is that your individual schema is not supported by anything. So, for Chabani Manganyi, the result of this, as we've said, is that, you come as a black person to experience the world, as you come to experience your body as an object, as something that is outside of yourself, and there is, actually, I think he has a chapter where he talks about this in his book, but he says that one of the obvious ways in which you come as a black person to experience, your body as an object is in the sense of bodily aesthetics. The kind of, notions of beauty that we come to embrace as black people. So as we've said, you have a sense of yourself and how beautiful your culture is, and how beauty is looked at, in your culture. But you then encounter a world that says no. If you want to claim beauty, this is how you should appear. This is how the world knows, according to the sociological schema, this is what being beautiful, means. And therefore, what you then end up as a black person doing is basically to conform, and therefore you make yourself available as an object to these changing Western notions of beauty, and so your body becomes basically divorced, from your inner self in terms of, how you define beauty, because it then just becomes something that is available to be fashioned and refashioned, in accordance with, the prevailing notion of bodily aesthetics that the sociological schema prefers, as opposed to what, you individually may think of. Now, in the book, Being Black in the World, Chaban Manganyi has a chapter that is titled Nausea. No, it's not going to start. So Chaban Manganyi has a chapter in the book titled Nausea. Now this is nausea, not in the medical sense, when you feel like vomiting. This is again a play on a title of a novel. Sartre, a French philosopher. I think you have to try something better. Yeah. It's titled Nausea. Now, as I've said, this is not nausea in the medical sense of the term, when you feel like vomiting. This is a play on a title of a novel that Sartre wrote in 1928. Sartre has a novel titled Nausea. Now, Sartre's object in that novel was to understand something, he calls existentialism. Sartre was an existential philosopher. Now, when Manganyi turns onto this chapter in the book called Nausea, his concern is to explain something called the existential vacuum. Now, what is this thing called the existential vacuum? Modern life, because of its nature, basically, everyone who lives in the modern period, psychologists have figured out, has moments when, nothing basically in society can show up his or her life. In simpler terms, in modern life, everyone comes to a moment when they experience a certain questioning of the purpose of life. So when we are tired of waking up, going to work, earning a salary, waking up, going to work, and live through that routine, and when you ask yourself, what is the purpose of all of this? Why do I have to go through this routine every day? At that point, when you begin to question the purpose, of life, when the routine of modern life no longer, makes sense to you, or rather, when momentarily that routine loses its hold over you or can no longer, be self-justifying, and when you begin to question, why you have to go through that routine and you want to give up, that kind of life, That's the moment we call the existential vacuum. That moment when life loses its purpose, or when the meaninglessness of life, comes to prevail or predominate. That moment when that happens is what, is called the existential vacuum. So when you ask yourself, why all of this? Why do I have, to go through all of this? At that point, you are going through what is called an existential vacuum. Now, people these days talk about this in a slightly different way, about, a midlife crisis and all sorts of things, It is basically in the nature of modern life, because what modern life does, it basically turns you into a machine-like entity. It basically turns human beings into machine-like entities. You have to live a regimented life. Modern life, or the modern political and economic social organization of society, determines your place for you as an individual. It determines what you are going to do, how you are going to do it, at what point you are going to do it. It determines when you should marry. It determines, when you should buy a house. It determines all the things that you do that you think are your own volition are determined for you in modern life, because as a modern person, that image of a modern person that we spoke of, we know what a modern person is, isn't it? Someone who goes to school, up until 18, 19, then goes to the university, starts working, then buys a house, and then takes a life insurance, takes a bond, takes a death benefit, and, does all of those things. And you think you are all of these things are your own volition. They are already determined for you in the nature of modern life, because this is what is expected of a modern person. So, because modern life turns you into a machine-like entity, there are times when it can no longer be able to justify itself to you. There are moments when you say, but what is the meaning of all of this? What is the purpose of all of this? Couldn't life be structured differently rather than this way? At that moment, when you come face to face with the fact that the life as you live it is not your own determination, is what we call the existential vacuum. Now, when that moment hits, when you say, but why all of this? Why do I have, to do all of this? Why do I have to wake up? Why is life this way? Chabani Manganyi says that for a white person, the answer to that why is different from the answer to that why from a black person. When you have to answer that question as a black person, why do I have to go through all of this? What is the meaning of this life? Your answer, according to Chabani Manganyi, is different from the answer that a white person would give. This is where Chabani Manganyi turns to Camus and turns to Sartre's novel, Nausea. Because both Camus and Sartre, not that they both end in God, but, both of them allude to God. Because for a white person, the answer through that existential vacuum, through that crisis, would be to say, but why did God create the world the way it is? Camus, of course, would go beyond that and say that, the solution maybe is just suicide. Whereas, Chabani Manganyi says that for a black person, he knows that the world is as is because it is the white person that has made it to be so. The way you live your life today as you do, you know that it's not a God's creation. You know that it is a white person that has determined the world as is for you as a black person, and you live your life in accordance with the dictates that have been given to you by the white person. Again, these dictates that we're talking about are not that the white person came through colonialism and through the barrel of the gun and said, this is how we are going to live. there is something else that it depended on. It is the modern knowledge that you learn in these universities that suggests to you that this is how a modern person should be, and this is how the world is. You've come to think that modern knowledge basically comes off, or is the mirror of this natural state of things. Or you've come to think that, modern knowledge, is basically a reflection of the natural state of things. You've come to think that modern knowledge describes the world as it is. Shabani Manganye's point is that no. When you come to those moments of crisis as a black person in this country, you realize that your existential vacuum, your experience of an existential vacuum is drawn from nowhere else other than from white people's design of the world. And so your answer to this question of the why, what's the meaning, why the world or life has become such a meaningless, endeavor, your answer is different from the answer that a white person would give, to that same question. So, if there are moments when in modern life we experience this existential vacuum, again, for black people it seems, reading Shabani Manganye, that this moment of an existential vacuum is not just a momentarily, experience for black people. It's a permanent state. We live in a permanent state of an existential vacuum because every day we live through life that has been designed for us by white people. We come, face to face with the fact that, the meaninglessness of the world is as a result of our relationality to white people. Now, how does this happen every day? It is in that encounter between the individual schema and the sociological schema. Because every day, it is hardly the case that there is no day, or rather there is hardly a day that goes by without the conflict between your individual schema and the sociological schema. Every day, if you live in this country, you realize that the world is designed to be white. And you are black, or you want to be black in a world that is designed to be white. And so for us, that existential vacuum is a permanent state. That is why, he says that we experience our bodies as objects, as things that are external to us. An object is something that has no meaning, that is available for fashioning and refashioning, in different ways every day. So that is why, he says that for us, that existential vacuum, is a permanent state, because every day we come to realize that the meaninglessness of the world is as a result of the fact that it has been designed by white people to be so. So, to try and, end off, let us now think about how does all of this come about? How does all of this come about? The fact that we know, at least now, that there is this disjuncture between the individual schema and the sociological schema for black people. But why is it that we continue then to drift towards the sociological schema that is not ours? Why do we continue to want, to live our lives in this same sociological schema that is alienating, quote and unquote? Now, this is where Western education and colonial education becomes key. Because despite everything we have said here, you are going to come to a conclusion that, well, but I have to leave. You are going to try and become rational and calculating. And so as a rational and a calculating, modern individual that you think you are then going to say, well, but a more rational, calculative, conclusion here is that, well, I have to live life in this way because, this is how the world is. The world is not is, the world has been designed to be what it is. So if you had an education system that enabled you differently, you could actually turn your back on, that world that turns you into an object. You could have, the confidence and the cultural resources, if you had a proper education that would enable you turn away from, that sociological schema, not avail your body to that sociological schema that says, you are this kind of a person as a black person, and therefore you must avail your body such that it is manipulated or manipulable in the ways in which it wants to manipulate it. But because the purpose of education that you go through is not just to enable you, earn a cheap salary, when you're done, it is to construct you to accept certain things as normal and truthful. So you accept and think that, this is how the world is and this is how the world, should be. And therefore, what Western education has done, it has legitimated the truthfulness of this disjuncture between your individual schema and the sociological schema. I thank you very much.